Well, congratulations on the film. It's so moving, and this is a film that I saw at the London Film Festival last year, and it's one of those ones that kind of stuck with me. So you wrote the script, you directed the film as well. Where did the inspiration come from? Was it something you'd experienced yourself or heard about?
The story's not autobiographic, but it is inspired by people in my life. It's inspired by experiences that I've had. You know, the character of Mary is very much based on my mum, who is a Muslim convert and, you know, lives in Kent with my dad and, you know, have a large family. But the main thrusts of the film, kind of the deeper themes of grief and loss and kind of how we calibrate our identities over time is something that felt very close to home. And it was something that I've always wanted to explore in a kind of feature-length film.
And it is very much about mixed race relationships. I mean, there's the obvious one with Mary, but also there's the other one as well, which is equally important. Why did you want to explore that particular theme? I mean, I have to say there was this very strong sense of Mary having sacrificed an awful lot in her life to be with the man that she married.
I think that's a really interesting takeaway, and I think it's valid, but I think I also see it as Mary gaining different layers to her identity. I do think how we see things often depends on what our perspective is and where we're standing. And of course, like any marriage, like any relationship, there's a huge amount of sacrifice, of compromise. But it's absolutely true. Mary as a character is someone who has had to compromise in many ways to be with her husband. But I think also she has gained a huge amount too. So I kind of reject that she's a character who is a shell of herself or, you know, has no agency. But it is a story about a woman who goes on a journey, who understands the bigger picture of how her specific journey and what that means to her kind of at the end. I think by the end of the film, she's in a position where she's able to see more holistically kind of, I guess, the choices that she made for the man that she loved and where that's led her. And ultimately, I do think that it's not really a spoiler, but I do think at the end, there is a sense of a new beginning, a potential new kind of, a new life in some ways, which is, I think, something that Mary had always wanted. I'm not going to say what it is, but I think you know what I mean. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, I do, certainly. You mentioned the theme of grief as well. And it was very noticeable that was done very much from the female perspective. I mean, there was that wonderful image of Mary sat with all the women around her, where she's sort of sat shell-shocked after what's happened. We don't see much of it from the male perspective.
I think because this is a story about Mary, I guess it's a story about a woman who is inspired by my mum in many ways. And I grew up in a very female-centric family, also in a very female-centric culture. You know, for the first 16 years of my life, I only had sisters. I have a much younger brother now, but so I was always around women and girls. And I don't know, I wanted to explore, I guess, the kind of the quiet experiences of grief, those moments when you're in your own head or you're making a cup of tea and you accidentally make a second cup for the person that you've lost. It's those really truthful experiences that we have when we lose people that we love. And for me, it was about showing the quieter, more internalized grief.
And actually getting used to having your own space again.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's an interesting point, because it's one of the questions I wanted to raise in the film is like, who are we? I mean, because when we're in long-term relationships and in marriages, we kind of meld into each other in a way. Our identity becomes kind of fixed and orbits around the other person. And I guess one of the things that I was curious about exploring is when we lose that person who gives us our gravity and keeps us in orbit, what remains of ourselves? Like, where do we go off? How do we find our way back? And how do we essentially recalibrate our own sense of self? Because I think when we're in long-term relationships, we we evolve around each other. And I wanted to make a film that, I guess, looked at a woman who was having to repiece herself.
You set the film mainly in Dover. I mean, you're from Kent yourself, but you're from Medway, so there's a bit of a distance between the two. Why did you decide to set it in Dover? I mean, was it a place that you knew, or was it actually because of the channel and that sort of, I suppose it's a bit of an image for the division between Mary and this other life, and actually a completely different world for her as well?
Both of those reasons. So my grandparents lived in Folkestone, so I spent my whole childhood on those cliffs looking out at this kind of almost touchable world. And I'm from quite a large family, so we didn't have a huge amount of money to go kind of on far-flung holidays. So we would go to Calais or to Great Yarmouth or more locally. And so I was always really fascinated by how on the surface these two towns share a lot of similarities. They're very transient. They're both having a kind of identity crisis, but they both also have a very specific kind of national identity with their own countries. And the film is looking at that kind of fusion of how, you know, that kind of identity switch, how the layers of us are made up of, you know, many different kind of facets. And I thought as an image, this kind of channel that separates these two women was a very strong one. How, you know, the way when I was writing, I kind of thought of Mary in her kitchen, having a cup of tea, looking out of her kitchen window and seeing Calais. And there was a huge irony in that for me, because the film is looking at kind of the people that we share our lives with can also be the biggest strangers to us. You know, there can be huge parts of someone that we never know, the secrets that we keep from one another. And there was a real power, I think, that was bound up in the idea of Calais being kind of in sight, but Mary never really fully seeing it. Do you know what I mean? Like, she lives with this man her whole life and she doesn't fully see him. And I thought it was a kind of a visual representation of that, which I thought was quite strong.
The film's actually quite sparse on dialogue, really. And I wondered how much of that was to do with the fact that Joanna Scanlan, who plays Mary, wears a hijab most of the time, which frames her face in a very sort of cinematic sort of way. So that actually the camera's always focused on her face, and maybe you didn't need that much dialogue.
For me, it was I think Mary wearing the headscarf absolutely frames the face, and I think is a byproduct in a way, like the kind of there's no need to kind of have so many words when you have such a kind of focused image on a face. But at script stage, it was always very sparse, and in the edit, it became even sparser. We pulled lines back even further. I just felt I don't know. I'm the kind of filmmaker that prefers to kind of show and not tell, and also I do have a respect and a trust in the audience to be able to kind of follow and to make up their own minds about what it is I'm trying to explore. For me, ultimately, you make a film for an audience to then kind of internalize and make their own. So I didn't want to underline things by giving too many words away. And also, when we have incredible actors like Natalie Richard and Joanna Scanlan, we don't need that, because they're so expressive and they're such great actors.
I mean, Joanna's fantastic in the role. How did you get her involved? I believe you've actually said she reminds you of your own mum.
They're very different characters, but on a very superficial level, I guess on a physical level, there are resemblances, which was a real draw to me. I mean, Shaheen Baig, who's our lovely casting director, suggested Joanna, and I was familiar with some of her TV work, and I know that she's primarily known for her TV work, but I was always very impressed with the smaller bits that I'd seen of her in films. Again, very kind of quiet, underplayed, and very expressive. So, and when I met her, I just knew that she had something to explore, because I think comedy actors always have a deeper well of something more gnarly to kind of get into. And Natalie Richard as well. When I met her, there was a kind of an instinctive trust and joy really working with her. So yeah, it was I was lucky.
Just one final question. How much work did Joanna have to do to sort of absorb herself in the culture, and how much were you able to help her with that?
It's very important. It was very important for me that Joanna understood the importance, the responsibility that I felt as the writer and director from that community to kind of portray that community properly on screen. And she absolutely understood her own responsibility in that role. And there was a huge amount of prep. I mean, I compile quite large dossiers of kind of backstory, even down to kind of the blood type of a character, the physiological, sociological, psychological aspects of a character when I'm writing. And I give all of that work to the actor when we're prepping. You know, Joanna came round, she met my mum. My mum taught her how to cook saag paneer and make roti. And my mum gave her a bag of clothes to take home and wear and live in. And it was important for me that Joanna lived in the skin of this character, because it was a part that it's a role that she's never played before. It's a community that she's representing that she's never represented before. And for me, when she's walking in the street, I wanted her to know what it felt like to wear a headscarf and for people to look at you in perhaps maybe a different way. And I think all of that helped to kind of internalize the character. And I think she really enjoyed and got a lot from meeting my mum in particular, because I think my mum is so wonderful and had a lot to kind of share. So yeah, there was a lot of prep.
That's great. I mean, you know, she gives such a wonderful performance. I think we've run out of time, unfortunately, but thank you so much for your time, and really thank you for such a beautiful film as well.